Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to try to get to the bottom of something pretty wild. All these allegations that Obama was wiretapping Trump back in 2016 during the election.
Sounds a little out there, right?
Yeah. You guys sent us a ton of stuff about this, and we've got this podcast episode from Right Wing News, and the host calls himself, get this, the voice of reason.
Oh, boy.
Plus, we've got some other sources that approach this whole thing a little bit differently. So we've really got our work cut out for us today.
Yeah, it is. It's quite a mix. I mean, this Voice of Reason episode is like full of unverified claims.
Huh.
So we're gonna have to like really dig in and see how, how they hold up against some more well-established reporting.
Okay, so let's start with that Right Wing News episode. This guy, he does not hold back.
No, yeah.
He's like straight up calling for Obama and everyone who worked for him to be like tarred and feathered for, supposedly using government agencies against Trump.
Yeah. That language is wow. It really sets the tone, doesn't it? It's like right off the bat, we're dealing with strong opinions here, not necessarily, cold, hard facts.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to talk about how Trump wanted Congress to investigate all this. And his argument is that Trump wouldn't have done that unless he had, like, rock solid evidence.
But like, what evidence are we even talking about? Like, did Trump ever actually show anything publicly? The host doesn't really get into that.
No, that's a great point. That's a pretty big hole in his argument, right? And then he brings up these reports from The Guardian and the BBC about how the FBI was trying to get FISA warrants, to keep tabs on some people in Trump's campaign.
Right.
But he kind of mixes that up with Trump's whole wiretapping thing. Like, those investigations were more about possible connections with Russia, which is a whole other can of worms.
So he's like connecting two things that are definitely related, but not the same at all.
Exactly. Yeah, it's kind of misleading. And then, get this, he latches on to the fact that the FISA warrant was actually denied at first.
Oh, right, yeah.
And he's saying that means Obama's administration had, like, no reason to even ask for it.
But wait, wasn't that Guardian article saying that those warrants, they don't get denied often, but it does happen sometimes?
You're absolutely right. They even mentioned that a more specific warrant was approved later on. So this host's take seems way too simplistic.
Yeah, okay.
And then he goes off the rails completely. He starts saying Obama came up with this super complex plan to spy on Trump, get Hillary elected, and then erase all the evidence.
Oh, come on. Like, it's starting to sound like a bad spy movie.
Right, but where's the proof? And then, to top it off, he brings up Mark Levin, that other conservative radio guy, as like a source of evidence.
It's like a textbook example of an echo chamber.
Exactly. It just shows how important it is to consider different viewpoints, not just hear what you want to hear.
Okay, so to sum up, this right-wing news episode is super biased, uses a lot of emotional language, and doesn't really give us any facts to back things up.
Yeah.
But here's what I find really interesting, even though it's like shaky on the facts. This episode somehow became really popular and helped spread the whole wiretapping story. It just shows how easily misinformation can take off, especially when it, confirms what people already believe.
That's a really good point. It really shows how crucial it is to be a critical thinker, especially when it comes to the media. Now, let's shift gears and check out that Guardian article, FBI sought FISA warrant to monitor Trump team's links with Russia. This one gives us a totally different perspective.
Okay, and this was published right in the middle of the election, right? October 2016.
Yep. And what I found really interesting is that it confirms the FBI was investigating the Trump campaign, but the focus was on Russia, not wiretapping.
Okay.
And, to get a FISA warrant, they need a good reason, right? They need to show the court they have a solid case.
So they couldn't just go in there and say, hey, we think these guys are doing something shady. They had to have actual evidence.
Exactly. So even though this podcast guy is trying to make it seem like Obama was just attacking Trump for no reason, the Guardian's reporting suggests that intelligence agencies were genuinely worried about something.
Okay, so not just some political vendetta then.
Right. And remember, the Guardian is usually seen as leaning to the left. They're not exactly known for defending Trump.
That's true. And they also mentioned that the FISA court didn't approve the warrant right away, which totally contradicts what the podcast said about those denials being super rare and politically motivated.
You got it. That's a super important detail. It shows the system has checks and balances, right? Plus, The Guardian says that the whole thing started because some allied agencies were worried about Russia, too.
So this wasn't just an Obama thing then?
Nope. It adds this whole international angle that the podcast completely ignores. And it really weakens their whole argument about Obama being behind some, big political witch hunt. The Guardian also points out that the investigation was initially focused on just 4 people in Trump's campaign, but it got bigger as they learned more.
So it wasn't like they just decided to go after Trump and his people for no reason.
Exactly. It was a legitimate investigation that grew as they found more evidence. And, this is important, The Guardian never actually says whether Trump himself was ever a target.
Oh.
So even though this article confirms there was an investigation, it doesn't back up the podcast's claim that Trump's phones were actually tapped.
It sounds like that podcast cherry-picked information to fit their story,
Right.
while The Guardian gives a more, balanced and factual account.
That's a really important takeaway here. Now let's see how the BBC, another big international news organization, covered this whole thing. They had this article, Trump-Russia Affair, Key Questions Answered, and it came out in May 2017, a few months after Trump took office. It basically gives a rundown of how the whole thing played out and what the big questions were at the time.
So we're moving from the crazy election season to, like, the aftermath, when all these investigations were really ramping up.
Right. And instead of just focusing on the whole wiretapping thing, the BBC kind of widens the lens. They're asking, did Russia actually mess with the election to help Trump?
Yeah.
That broader perspective is important because it shows how complicated everything was and it doesn't jump to conclusions.
Yeah, it also acknowledges that there were all these investigations going on, so it's like, hold on, we don't have all the answers yet.
Exactly. And then the BBC gets into the evidence for Russian interference, and they bring up intelligence reports that say, yeah, Russia did try to mess with the election.
Which lines up with what we saw in that Guardian article, right? Like, multiple agencies, both here and abroad, were saying the same thing.
Exactly. It's starting to seem like that right-wing news podcast is kind of in its own world, downplaying the whole Russia thing.
Yeah, it's definitely a different take.
For sure. The BBC also mentions that whole thing with the Democratic Party emails getting hacked and leaked on WikiLeaks.
Right.
And U.S. intelligence, they think Russia was behind that too, which is huge because the timing of those leaks and what was in them, it all points to someone trying to hurt Hillary's campaign and help Trump.
It adds another layer to everything and makes you wonder if Trump's people were working with Russia during the election.
Right, which became the whole focus of the Mueller investigation.
Oh, right. Special counsel Robert Mueller.
Yep. And the BBC says, look, there's evidence that people in Trump's campaign were talking to Russians, but there's no smoking gun that proves they were actually working together.
That's an important difference. Just
Yeah.
because you can't prove something doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Exactly. In the end, the Mueller report, it didn't find enough to say there was criminal collusion between Trump's campaign and Russia. But the report did show all these contacts between Trump's people and Russians, which, raises questions about what they were talking about.
So there's still a lot we don't know.
Yeah, there are still a lot of unanswered questions. The BBC also brings up Comey getting fired, which a lot of people saw as Trump trying to stop the investigation.
Oh, right.
And that's actually what led to Mueller getting appointed, which really turned up the heat. It shows how high the stakes were in this whole thing. They don't just appoint a special counsel every day.
Yeah, it's not something they take lightly.
No. And the BBC ends by saying, look, we may never know for sure just how much Russia interfered or if there was any collusion.
That's kind of unsettling, right? Like, we may never have all the pieces of the puzzle.
It shows you how complicated and secretive intelligence stuff can be. A lot of times we're left with more questions than answers. So basically, we have these two competing stories. The right-wing news podcast, all focused on wiretapping and this idea of a deep state conspiracy, and then sources like The Guardian and the BBC giving us a more nuanced and factual account of Russian interference and the investigations that followed.
It's like night and day. And it makes you wonder which story actually took hold with the public.
That's a great question. It shows how powerful stories are and how they shape what people believe, even if they're not totally true. And speaking of stories, let's look at what Trump himself said. We've got this article from Breitbart, a pretty conservative news site that covers Trump's accusations against Obama.
Breitbart, huh? They're known for their, let's say, strong opinions.
Yeah, you could say that. The article is titled, Get This, Trump, Terrible. Just found out that Obama had my wires tapped in Trump Tower just before the victory. Nothing found. This is McCarthyism. And it quotes these tweets from Trump where he straight up says Obama tapped his phones during the campaign. And that's where the whole wiretapping thing blew up and everyone started talking about it. It was like a media frenzy.
So that's when this story really took off, fueled by Trump himself.
Yep. And it's important to note that the article even says that Trump didn't offer any proof for his claims. That becomes a pattern throughout this whole
It's
thing.
like the claim itself was supposed to be the proof.
It's kind of wild, isn't it? And then the article talks about how people reacted to Trump's tweets, saying Obama's spokesperson denied everything. So now it's like a he said, she said situation, which just makes things even more confusing.
So both sides are digging in and refusing to budge.
Exactly. And the article even points out that some Republicans weren't buying it either. Some defended Trump, but others were skeptical.
So even among people who generally agree with Trump, there were doubts.
Yeah, which again shows how weak the evidence was. And then, to no one's surprise, the article ends by saying all of this is part of the deep state working against Trump.
Right, that whole conspiracy theory about this secret group of government officials trying to take down Trump, it becomes a central theme for him and his supporters. It's like a way to dismiss any criticism or opposition as fake and part of some bigger plot.
It's a powerful way to talk to people, even if there's no evidence to back it up. But how did the White House under Trump respond to all this? We have a statement from his press secretary at the time, Sean Spicer, that might shed some light on that.
So you got Trump making these crazy accusations, but with nothing to back them up. And then the White House, with Spicer, is calling for an investigation. What's the deal with that?
Well, what's interesting here is that the White House is trying to change the subject instead of showing us any evidence. Spicer's statement basically repeats what Trump said, calls it troubling, and then tells Congress to investigate whether Obama overstepped his bounds.
It's like they're trying to deflect, right? Turn the accusation into a demand for an investigation.
Exactly. It takes the pressure off of them to provide evidence and puts it on Congress to figure out if the claims are true or not. And Spicer tries to connect the wiretapping thing with the investigations into Russian interference, making it seem like it's all part of the same problem.
So it's like creating this story that something bigger is happening, even if there's no proof for the wiretapping itself.
Right. And then, of course, Spicer ends by saying the White House will totally cooperate with any investigation from Congress. It's a classic move, trying to look transparent while also buying themselves some time.
So we've got these two different sides of the story, no real evidence, and everyone's calling for an investigation. It's like a recipe for chaos and distrust. Thank goodness for fact checkers, right?
Yeah.
That brings us to this PolitiFact article, fact-checking Trump's wiretap claim.
Yeah.
They actually dig into the evidence, or lack thereof, and try to figure out what's really going on.
Yeah, PolitiFact starts by pointing out that Trump offered no evidence, which, as we've seen, is a running theme in this whole thing. Then they go through all these sources, statements from officials, court documents, media reports, you name it, to see if there's any truth to what Trump's saying.
It's like they're doing the investigation that the White House should have been doing.
Right. They're doing us all a big favor. And remember James Comey, the FBI director. He told Congress straight up that he had no information that supports those tweets from Trump.
That's a pretty strong denial from the head of the FBI.
Right. It pretty much shuts down Trump's claims. And PolitiFact also looked into that FISA warrant that was issued to monitor Carter Page, that guy from Trump's campaign. But, as we discussed, that was part of a larger investigation into Russia's involvement. It wasn't about wiretapping Trump personally.
And PolitiFact reminds us that getting a FISA warrant is a serious deal. They need strong evidence, and a judge has to sign off on it.
Yeah, it's not something they do lightly. And the fact that they renewed the warrant several times tells you the FBI had a good reason to be investigating. So, after looking at all the evidence, PolitiFact says Trump's claim that Obama wiretapped him is false.
Wow, so they flat out called it false.
Yeah, they did. And that just shows how important it is to rely on trustworthy sources of information, especially these days when misinformation is everywhere.
Okay, so now let's look at the big picture with the Senate Intelligence Committee report. This came out in 2019 after a 2-year investigation, and both parties were involved. They were looking into Russia's interference in the 2016 election.
This report's a big deal. It goes beyond the wiretapping claims and gives us a full picture of what happened.
So what did they find out?
They said, without a doubt, that the Russian government messed with the 2016 election in a sweeping and systematic fashion. It confirms everything we've been talking about. This was a real attack on American democracy.
And how did they do it?
They used all sorts of tricks, hacking, spreading fake news, manipulating social media. It was a sophisticated and coordinated plan to cause chaos and influence the election.
What about Trump's campaign? Did they find anything that proved they worked with Russia?
That was the big question. The report did find a bunch of contacts between people from Trump's campaign and Russians. but they couldn't definitively say that Trump's campaign planned or conspired with Russia to interfere in the election.
So they were talking, but no proof they were working together. It's still kind of unclear then.
Yeah, it is. And these investigations are often messy like that. But what's important is that the report backed up what the intelligence community had been saying.
So it wasn't just some political hit job like some people were saying.
Exactly. The report also suggested ways to make our elections more secure and stop foreign interference in the future. It said everyone needs to work together, intelligence agencies, law enforcement, even private companies.
So it's not just about figuring out what happened in 2016, but stopping it from happening again.
Absolutely. And for our last source, let's turn to a legal analysis from the Lawfare blog.
Legal take on this. This should be good. The title of the analysis is pretty straightforward. The Wiretapping Non-Scandal.
Yeah, they don't mince words, do they? The analysis systematically breaks down Trump's claims, looking at the legal and factual basis or lack thereof for his accusations.
So what are the main points?
Well, they start by explaining the laws about wiretapping, emphasizing that you need a warrant from a judge to do it. You can't just wiretap someone because you feel like it.
It's a big deal with lots of legal protections.
Right. And then, of course, they point out that Trump never offered any proof for his claims. They also bring up those statements from intelligence officials, including Comey, who said they didn't know anything about any wiretapping.
So they're pretty much debunking everything Trump said.
Exactly. And they repeat that the FISA warrant on Carter Page was part of a different investigation about Russia and had nothing to do with wiretapping Trump directly. The analysis concludes that there's no credible evidence to back up Trump's claims.
Wow, so from a legal perspective, they're saying it's completely bogus.
Pretty much. It shows how risky it is to make serious accusations without any proof.
Okay, so we've reached the end of our deep dive. We've looked at a ton of sources from that first podcast that started this whole thing to official statements, fact checks, a report from the Senate, and even a legal analysis. It's been quite a journey. What do you think are the biggest takeaways here?
What really stands out to me is how this whole thing shows how powerful misinformation can be, especially online. Trump's tweets, even though they were completely made up, they created a storm of controversy that's still going on today.
It's like a reminder that just because something is true doesn't mean people will believe it, especially when you've got people in power spreading lies that fit with what people already think.
Exactly. It also shows how important it is to check facts and be smart about what we read and hear in the media. We can't just believe everything we see. We need to think critically, question what we're told, and look for evidence.
It's more important than ever to be able to tell what's true from what's fake, especially with so much information out there these days.
Absolutely. And one last thing, this whole deep dive shows us that we need to see the big picture. The wiretapping thing, while it was a big distraction, it was really just a sideshow compared to the bigger issue of Russia messing with the 2016 election.
It's easy to get caught up in the drama of accusations, but we need to focus on what really matters and understand how these things fit into the bigger story.
Well said. So, to everyone listening, as you keep learning about this complicated issue, remember to stay curious, be skeptical, and stay engaged. Don't be afraid to question things, look for different points of view, and even challenge your own beliefs.
And most importantly, keep digging deeper. There's always more to learn. That's it for this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and got you thinking. Until next time, happy diving.